Really cool. We had Kelly asking if you can disclose the funding sources or like how your funding's structured for your programs.
Sure. 100% of it is Medicaid waiver. In Missouri, it's called the comprehensive waiver. And so there's been a really big move over the last 5 to 7 years to get everybody off the wait list and eligible for the waiver. So as I get calls for parents, the first question that I ask them is, does your individual, their family, are they aware of the Medicaid waiver? And so at this point in time, individuals then typically would get, assigned. It had been the case they would get assigned a score based on their level of need. The higher the score, the more they need, and they would be placed faster. Um, but the case now is there's still a small waiting list, but for the most part, it is a Medicaid waiver, and then our behavioral services are billed separately. So similar to commercial insurance, we would go through and we would make a yearly at the time of the ISP or the individual support plan, we would make a request. We're very, very blessed in Missouri. We can actually request behavioral services for a year. And so as we go through this, as we go through and get the funding for it set up, the funding is good for a year. So I actually would request and say, okay, this is what I need. These are the number of units I need for my BCBA, my BCABA, and my RBT. And we actually get to go through that. And then each year, as we want to change that and tweak that, we can at the individual support plan meeting or the ISP meeting. And medical services are all wrapped in that through the Medicaid waivers. So as individuals go out and see doctors, whether it's a primary, psychiatrist, others.
Do they cap the amount of units that you can use for the different categories?
We get a lot of pushback if we're over, I would say for a BCBA, over 10 to 20 hours a week. On average, I typically request 4 to 5 hours of BCBA time and maybe 6 to 8 hours of RBT time. Now, there's a scale that the state uses that actually goes through, and as you apply for and you try to get the initial units for your FBA, then you look at the acuity, the frequency of the behavior, and then they will actually scale that based on the acuity and then how many units you would get for that year. And so we've never asked for anything north of, I would say 6 hours in a given week. My guess would be, though, as you got north of 10, you would start getting a lot of pushback. Another thing I think that's a beauty with the state of Missouri is that the state behavior analyst, the chief behavior analyst, has essentially told the utilization review committees across the state that look at these requests for services by behavior analysts like a doctor's prescription.
Was that Stoutemore? Who's the state?
It is Terry Rogers.
Terry Rogers, that's right.
Yes. And so, as you go through and you look at it, it's, she said, it's like a doctor's order. You guys need to follow that. So the last 2 or 3 years, that's been the case. It has been fantastic. Pretty much what we ask for, we get. But I think that it's only fair because we're taking a lot of folks and others are not served.
In Colorado, they are tiered and capped regardless of the need. So you get 10 hours of assessment, you get 52 hours of counseling, and you get 40 hours of consultation per year. And
how are the tiers determined?
The tiers do not take into account behavior. They take into account health and safety in the community, which you can kind of tie it in there, but behavior is not taken into consideration. Medically fragile will move them up the tiers, but those tiers don't affect those caps. So if they're a tier 7, which is the highest tier, they do not get any different behavior units. And some states are the same. Some states don't have limits. Like New Mexico, I do not believe has caps, and Wyoming doesn't have caps, but in Colorado they capped it. So it's a struggle because regardless of the need, you get the same amount. It can be someone that talks to themselves and bothers their caregiver, and someone who is an interior decorator, like the guy's pictures you showed.
Right.
And they get exactly the same units.
Yeah.
It's pretty frustrating.
Yeah, it is. It's got to be.
You had mentioned something, John, which when I was working with adults with intellectual disabilities, we ran into this where oftentimes parents would come in wanting to have a graduate of a high school program saying, all right, I heard through the grapevine, in the community that you all could be the next person to help out my loved one. And if they hadn't first got aware of the service structure and the funding structures, oftentimes our wait was a year long. So I had a number of time where people would have a graduate in May come in the day after graduation, and then they would be in a complete state of panic, understandably, and how, just because they had someone that needed full-time attention that they were not ready to have a year off and to be able to handle as like a family unit, right? Because the services were just so uncoordinated. There was some money that came out for pre-employment transition services. This is probably 4 or 5 years ago now. But it allowed us as the organization that served adults to go into high schools, develop a short curriculum which was centered around self-advocacy, goal setting, things like that. But we treated it as not only that, but also a way to get information into parents' hands earlier. So when they were in high school, we were like, hey, be aware of essentially this is how it works in Nevada after your child graduates. And that was one of the things that was most heartbreaking when you had a parent that came through and there was no way to get the help they needed right away. Unless it was along kind of the lines of what Travis was saying of medical necessity or some sort of somewhat arbitrary decision was made. Y'all, we in a way we were able to start kind of filling that gap right across services. Do y'all experience anything like that where you're at, where there's just these giant gaps between, you were saying, there's fantastic funding and then it falls off, right? We had not only the funding fall off, but the awareness of what to even do next was not being taught.
Right, right. Well, the young man that did all the redecorating that I showed in the pictures, he actually had lived at home with mom, and they had some services in the home. He had a community-based school that was ASD specific that he went to outside of St. Louis. And there were a couple of times where, essentially once he got over 6'4", mom lived alone with the young man and his two brothers. So the two brothers moved to college, and that was a big enough change for him where he was getting her in headlocks, and, he would go down in the basement and he would hang on the pipes until the water pipes would burst. And they had all these issues in the home, and he had no waiver. Essentially, she had, prior to that time, he had been receiving in-home behavioral services by behavior analysts that would come see him, possibly at the school, maybe at home. So we had to go through the entire process, and for them, the wait, which was probably 11 plus months, so it's similar, Ryan, to what you're talking about. But his time was spent in Children's Hospital downtown. And essentially what they did is they put him on a medical unit, and he had 5-to-1 staffing in his room. And security had to be called several times a day to be able to come interact with him. And we've had 2 or 3 cases that have been like that, where the parents finally got to the situation where they said, we're not picking him up. Sorry, he's not safe at home. We're not going to do that. We're not going to pick him up. And so they stayed at Children's Hospital. We had another case that is out there, and you can Google it. It's a young man we're serving currently. That Children's Division is the guardian for this young man, because it was quoted in the KMOV article that Dad said, someone will die at our home if he stays here. His wife's he had detached his mom's retina, broken some ribs, and essentially the same thing happened. They went through, he was in the hospital, and said, nope, we're not picking him up. And Children's Division was able to take over guardianship. And, prior to the age of 21, for the question earlier about the Medicaid waiver, prior to the age of 21, Children's Division covers those costs. Yes, still at the state level, but there's a federal match, and they also work with the ultimate waiver provider before that switches over. But all 3 of those cases, there was at least a year wait as the individual went in. Some wrote it out in the state hospital. And, Children's hospitals for sick, medically fragile kids. And here you got a 6'4" guy that's in the room, tearing paper. And destroying the room, and they would go give him walks around the hospital with 3 security guards, and that's how he had to wait it out until we were able to come pick him up. So, and those are the lucky ones. I think those are the ones that we don't hear about, that have to wait those out at home.
Yeah.
There may not be the resources. It's mind-boggling. I don't know how a lot of those families do that.
Yeah, those numbers that you shared at the beginning of just putting into scope of how many people are affected, adults with intellectual disabilities, autism, etc., and coupled with those gaps in services or them not necessarily coordinating and communicating with each other, I lived that firsthand for a while, and I was like, holy cow, like this is insane. Especially if we're gonna have exponential growth or linear, like accelerated growth in the number of people we have to be serving, right?
Yeah, and it's like death and taxes. I mean, you say there's not too many certainties in life. These kids are going to grow up. They're going to get to be adults, and they're going to get to be 200 plus pounds. And Selena can attest, as we're working on licensure in Illinois, the big things that we're looking at are, looking at billing structures and insurance, and in most states that I've been a part of, where you've had legislators listen to people coming in to give testimony about autism, is autism insurance, and they have stories about little kids. But what about, there are times where, I've thought, especially the guy that did the damage in the photos, he would be great to bring to a hearing. And then, just see what he does to the chamber in there. And then people will be falling over themselves to be able to look at funding. But that's the sad part. I think that a lot of the folks that I'm talking about, that Travis is talking about, they typically are requiring these services, and we're meeting them at the age when most state insurance mandates are done. And that's the rough part.